Hi guys, my name is Jacqueline, and the formative lesson plan that I chose is the 7th grade solving linear equations lesson. And I completed the pre-assessment as if I were a student with ADHD. So first I want to mention what the pre-assessment is designed for. So the goals of this lesson are to assess how well students are able to write and solve linear equations, as well as how they are able to identify and use the distributive property. So at the beginning of class, students work independently on a short pre-assessment that will inform the teacher of their current understanding of the goals. The first part of the pre-assessment asks students to write an equation based on the question and to choose one or more of the 4 equations given as their correct answer. Although a point of the assessment is to identify who is able to recognize when to apply the distributive property, I would differentiate the question for a student with ADHD by including a hint to suggest considering a specific property in order to potentially spark their prior knowledge. Another thing that I would differentiate about this first problem would be the explain your answers part. From my experience, I've seen students with learning disabilities struggle with explaining their work in algebra, so I think it would be useful to ask a more specific question in order to accommodate all students in the class. Some examples of different questions could be, what steps did you use to find your answer? Or if you found more than one answer, explain how both are equal. And then for the last part of the first question, I would again be more specific by including, using your answer or answers from the first part, find the value of x, in order to continue being as clear as possible. I've had many students with ADHD who will approach a problem, read it, and just completely skip it because they don't know what it's asking. And when it gets to that point, they completely lose all focus. So for the second question on the pre-assessment, I would reorganize the whole problem so that it does not appear confusing or overwhelming. I would make the diagrams larger and list them vertically with the directions to find the area or perimeter outside of the boxes in a more typical direction format that students are used to seeing. I would also include a list of formulas for the area of a rectangle, the area of a square, the perimeter of a rectangle, and the perimeter of a square. However, I would still expect the students to choose the correct formula from their understanding of the directions and recall the properties of rectangles and squares on their own. Also, one of those 4 formulas would not even be used, and I would also expect them to acknowledge that as well. They also should be able to use substitution correctly and to use the distributive property again like they did in the first problem. The third question on the pre-assessment is similar to the first, as it expects students to write an equation based on the problem and select all that apply. This time, instead of including a hint, I will advise students to just refer back to problem 1 if they need help. However, I will differentiate the explain your answer part the same way I did for problem 1. And for the last part, I would rewrite the question as so. If the total of the equation is 170, what is the value of x? Once you have found x, what are the 3 consecutive numbers? And explain how you found these numbers, which again is just trying to maintain providing clear directions. Following the pre-assessment, questions will be constructed based on each student's work in order to focus their attention on where they require improvement. Although the questions should be clear for all students, I would make a point to be very specific for the student with ADHD and be available to provide assistance if they are still unsure of what they are being asked. After creating questions, students will then be given mini whiteboards, pens, and erasers, and will answer questions similar to the ones on the pre-assessment presented on the board during a whole class introduction of the topic. In order to accommodate the student with ADHD, I will be sure to allow for enough time so that they are able to answer questions along with their peers and be available to prompt them to refocus. It may even be beneficial to seat the student closer to where I would be in order to prompt them without distracting others. After the introduction, students will be given a set of cards with stories on them, and they will be asked to construct equations independently before they branch off into pairs or groups in order to collaborate. During this time, I would be sure to construct groups of students according to how they performed on their pre-assessment so that they all have similar goals to achieve together. This will especially be beneficial to the student with ADHD because they will be able to provide their own knowledge on topics similar to their peers as well as gaining knowledge from others. The student will also have the opportunity to develop better social skills from interacting with their peers. And then finally, at the end of the lesson, there will be a whole class discussion to see what students came up with and who changed their answers when matching stories independently first and then as a group. The overall aim of this discussion is to explore the reasoning behind some of the matches and help students justify their thinking. So then that is the end of the formative lesson plan on solving linear equations that I've differentiated for a student with ADHD.